So it's not that knowledge goes out and here is the world and we describe it.
Okay.
It's that it creates the world in its own image.
Most people looking at the world around, especially now, and the power the West has got, would say, it's difficult to accept that.
We have the idea that people think that West is best is no longer something that people just simply accept. The fact that the international human rights regime and the liberal order, which the Western powers built, they are now dismantling because it no longer works for them. The idea that Washington controls everything is overblown. The world that we live in, as I said before, was made by European colonialism. That world is no longer the same world. But then we end up wasting a lot of our time talking about a problem which is a problem for the Nasranis, not a problem for us. We have our own problems. Why do we need to borrow someone else's problems? After basically 150 years of European colonial rule, Kemalist rule, communist rule, why is it that it has been impossible to erase this thing that we call Islam in different ways? The struggle against Islamophobia is not just a struggle for Muslim rights, but it is a struggle to have a world which is full of pluralism.
Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Lanterns of Liberation. A society needs its own scholars, thinkers who shape how to understand the world, frame its narrative, and cultivate a shared way of thinking that becomes its collective common sense. Scholars help societies make sense of change, generate and interpret knowledge, and provide the stories that give people meaning, identity, and a glue to bind them as a common unit. Without its own distinctive way of knowledge formation or telling its own story, a society risks losing direction, cohesion, and the ability to innovate. It also struggles to offer a counter-narrative to the challenges it faces. To explore the importance of knowledge formation and the challenges facing Muslims, I am honored to welcome Professor Salman Sayyid. Professor Sayyid served as the head of the School of Sociology and Social Policy at the University of Leeds from 2017 to 2023. His research and publication focus on rhetoric, decolonial thought, Islamophobia, and critical Muslim studies. He is also the founding editor of the academic journal Reorient and the author of A Fundamental Fear and Recalling the Caliphate, among other influential works. Professor Sayyid, Assalamu alaikum, and Jazakallah khair for joining me at Lanterns of Liberation.
Assalamu alaikum. Great to hear you here.
Wonderful. So let's start with critical Muslim studies. You have been an architect in constructing this school of thought. Why is it important to evaluate and understand the nature of knowledge formation?
I think it's important that we understand knowledge that we get isn't simply neutral. It's not simply descriptive. It's very easy for people to nowadays, because we become perhaps more cynical, more kind of knowing, to accept that there may be bias, there may be influences on the way that we get to know things. What is more difficult for people to understand is that actually it's not just bias. Knowledge formation is really about understanding the world. And that understanding is rooted far more deeply than we think. So when you think about bias, you kind of often think that it's distortion. If you got the right people in, if you took out the influence of external funding or whatever it may be, they think you could clear it all up, right? What you don't think is that actually the way we classify the world itself is where the knowledge formation starts from. So it's not that knowledge goes out and here is the world and we describe it. Okay. It's that it creates the world in its own image.
So would you say then that the categories that are formed or the language we use and what those words mean have great significance?
Absolutely, because we only can interpret the world through various forms of language. Right. So we don't have any other way. You try and show me something which is not a word, and you can't. So in a sense, language and knowledge become very, very, how we know the world is how we speak about the world, how we write about the world, how we even watch the world, how we act in it. So it's really important for us to understand language isn't just the spoken word or the written word. It's actually the way that we understand And therefore, our ability to understand is changed by, for example, if we not just changing of words, but different kind of concepts, different ways of thinking about things changes everything that we understand about it. So this is a lot of the struggle, political struggle historically, has been around trying to create new common senses, new languages for understanding. So part of when we often talk about knowledge, we think that we're out there discovering,
Yeah.
when really what we're doing is creating rather than discovering, when we're actually founding rather than finding a world.
I mean, that's a very important point. I mean, most people would see knowledge as simply accumulative at GCSE level, at A level, at undergraduate, postgraduate, you're just becoming more knowledgeable. Would you see that's a trajectory we should be thinking about, or are you thinking about something different?
Well, I mean, this is one model of it. And having talked to some people who've got PhDs, including myself, I'm not sure there's always an accumulation. Okay. But leaving aside all of that, I think one of the things that we should be careful about is that, look, everyone understands that if you're teaching at one particular level, there's simplifications. And then you have to make things a bit more complicated. So A-level maths is very different from arithmetic that you may learn in primary school, and it should be. However, I think it's important to note that it's not a question of just becoming more and more complex. Sometimes it's also about unlearning. And the problem is this, that we're not always doing the unlearning, and therefore what you end up doing is producing a more complicated version of what you may have known before. So this is where the word critical comes into it, because the critical also asks questions about what we need to unlearn if we want to understand things better.
That brings me very well to the idea of the critical Muslim studies itself. You mentioned that critical Muslim study revolves around 4 pillars, or shall we say 4 horizons. And I want to take each one of them so that we can have a better understanding as to what you're trying to want people to adopt, or you want us to understand. And the very first one of that is you talk about the need for critical Muslim studies to be able to critique Eurocentrism. First, in very simple terms, why is that necessary?
Okay, so I think it's necessary because one of the ways that we have to get used to is the idea that the world we live in and our descriptions of it, our understanding of it, is a product of a particular history.
Okay.
If you allow me to give you 2 examples to illustrate this. If you are a school child in this country, you may in your classroom or somewhere along your primary school before you get there, you may see map of the world.
Yeah.
And in the map of the world, you will see something called Africa, something called Asia, something called... And you will think that these land masses, these continents, are how the world describes itself, right?
Yeah.
Now, when you say that actually, if you look at something like Asia, there is no category of Asia which is indigenous to Asia. So we know this, that for in what we now call Asia, some of the oldest writing cultures existed, like say 3,000, 2,000 BCE. So that's about 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, okay? And since then, none of them at any point, so they existed in what is now Iraq, what is now Pakistan, and India, and what is now in China. We have no record that they ever thought that we were all 3 of these groups are Asians, right? So now if you go and ask anyone in the streets where you are, and you say which continent, people will be able to say, we are Asian, we come from, or we are African, etc. Now what they're actually doing is reproducing a mapping that occurred around about the 15th, 16th centuries. And it's a mapping where Europe, which is not a continent in terms of what to use the language, goes and names everyone else as being a continent. Now you could say, okay, well, someone had to do it. Why does it matter?
Exactly. That was going to be next question.
Sorry.
What's the problem
with that?
What's the problem?
Well, the problem comes like this. You forget when Asia starts, when the consciousness of Asia comes, and it comes actually at the end of the 19th century, when scholars in China and Japan and initially, but then elsewhere, start absorbing that they are Asians to construct a different kind of a counterforce to European integration. Take, for example, the problem that many groups in the Americas, let's say the United States particularly, face in how do the indigenous people of the Americas describe themselves. Because in one way, the names that they've got are actually names given by European colonization. So if you want to resist that, is there a way of resisting it which allows you to talk about your own language? But this also creates a political problem, because if you don't talk about the Native Americans as being contrasted, let's say, the European colonization or European Americans, you don't then have any sense of unity, because these are people who are divided by many different languages, lifestyles, all sorts of things. And you can repeat that pattern again and again. So the problem isn't, oh, it's the wrong name or the right name. The problem is that if you don't know that there was a historical process that created this, you will think this was natural. If it's natural, you think there's nothing that can be done about it. But if you recognize that this was a historical creation, then it gives you an opportunity to think, well, we can have different kinds of creations. We can have different ways of understanding the world. And this becomes even clearer when you take, for example, the dispute around Palestine. How you name Palestine, whether you call it Israel or you call it the Holy Land, where does it begin? And all the efforts made to erase Palestine, both physically, but in terms of artifacts, in terms of its history, the denial of all of that. So once you recognize that even these very basic categories, which we use to organize our life with, and we don't think they're actually very, very problematic, if once we recognize that they all have some kind of history, then it gives us the possibility of reactivating that moment and saying, well, could we not imagine a different way of thinking about these things?
And you think Eurocentrism obviously is a culprit here?
Well, what the Eurocentrism does is this trick. It says that all the knowledge that we produced just happens to be European based because that's the way the world is, right? What actually happened, and I'll give you another example, is this, that European knowledge went hand in hand with the European ability to force the world into those silos made by that knowledge. To give you an example, when Europeans go to India, they say, well, we're going to have 4 castes.
Yes.
Right? So they take a very kind of complicated system of caste and they reduce it to 4 castes. And then what they do, they create bureaucratic systems which then force everyone to classify themselves according to those castes. And those 4 castes then become a way of organizing a particular kind of reality. Now, you can do this when you have the power to enforce that. When you don't have that power to enforce that, it becomes more and more complicated. Take something like, another example is religion. If you look at the earliest translations of the Quran, in English, let's say, around about the 16th century, they actually happen before the concept of religion takes off within European languages. So when the translators saw the word deen, they didn't translate it into religion because it didn't exist. They translated it into things like law or holy law. Now, if you start thinking for a minute, even among Muslim communities now, that if you say Islam is not a religion, but it is law or custom, suddenly everything changes.
The way you look at
the way you change, the way you look at Islam, what it means changes.
Absolutely.
So the division that you have, well, it's a religion, so therefore religion has a particular place, and all religions are patterned to Christianity.
Yeah.
So one of the things that happens among Muslims, if you go to any bookshop, Muslim bookshop, you will now often find books which will talk against Darwinism.
Yeah.
Right? And they're quite common, and people say that. And the question I will ask is, why is it? Why is it so? Because the problem with Darwinism comes from the history of biblical literature, right?
Yes.
But the Quran and the Bible are not the same book. They're not the same kind of text.
So we've actually ended up reducing the Quran like to the
Bible
because we equate it with a religion.
Exactly.
And hence the Eurocentrism needs to be critiqued.
And I want to just make one more point before we go to the next point, because I think what that does is create lots of problems. Firstly, we want Islam to be like a religion, means we're distorting Islam in itself. Secondly, if you think about the reason we're forgetting why the notion of, this thing about Darwinism became a problem
Yeah.
through the monkey trials, the history of them, it wasn't always a problem. It became a problem because the idea was this, that if you read the Bible in a particular way, the age of the earth is 6,000 years ago. I have not known any Hafiz or any Quranic scholar being able to say authoritatively that if you read the Quran, you can work out the exact age of the earth.
Okay.
It is
There's no correlation.
there's no correlation.
That's right.
So there's no problem.
Yeah.
But to be a religion, we have to have that problem. So in that sense, now this has a major, major significance. Now the Darwinism say could take it or leave it.
Yeah.
But then we end up wasting a lot of our time talking about a problem which is a problem for the Nasranis, not a problem for us. We have our own problems. Why do we need to borrow someone else's problems?
Okay, I understand what you're trying to tell us by challenging Eurocentrism. The second strand of critical Muslim studies is you say to look for an alternative source of knowledge. Can you expand what do you mean by alternative source? Because is that source is plural? And if it is plural, how do we talk about alternative sources? And maybe to use not political jargon, but academic jargon, or positivism and post-positivism. But I don't want to go down that road, right? I don't want to go down that road.
I understand that. I'm not going to spend too much time on that. But I think it's just worth saying something about the dominant way. Right now, if you want to say something is, there's a bit of knowledge which has authority, you give it to a white man in a white coat and they say scientifically true.
Okay.
Right? So there's a role of science in Western culture, even now, even with all the kind of skepticism and anti-vax, which is, but there is a sense in which there was a belief that what made Europe great was science. And the model that science had was based on the natural sciences. And the idea was this, that, look, we know how things work in the natural world. All we've got to do is apply the same tools and methods to the social world. So that's basically what positivism is. That basically you can work out the regularities, you can work out the laws, and you can apply it, and you'll know everything, right? So the idea would be this, and this, in a way, to some extent, ChatGPT is based on that everything, that all human knowledge, including knowledge about human societies and things, and etc., they can all be measured in the way that you would measure the number of atoms and things like that. And then once you measure it all, you can understand it all, okay? So that's the big model for everything. So the idea that model is actually is unsustainable, and it's unsustainable two levels. One is that even when scientists are doing science, they can't get away from the problem of language. And what I mean is that, so take someone like Richard Dawkins, who's a famous atheist and very, very hostile views of when he wants to demonstrate his atheism, he picks on Islam. So this is another interesting thing, right? So he has a book called he works on genes and things like that. And he tries to say, well, basically, there's something you call memes, which he took from something else, that there's all these, there's a God delusion, there's the selfish gene. Now, think about it for a minute. He's now using, this is a popular kind of thing, but the word selfish is a human trait. How would a gene be selfish or not? So you're already using your own descriptive mechanism to describe a phenomenon, which doesn't have a neutral language of its own. Once you say there's a selfish gene, then you can, I think it's a process of translation, you can understand it. And then what would be an unselfish gene? What could be so whatever language you use gets in the way. So the reason why, without getting into the technical things about it, I think critical Muslim studies needs to recognize, one of the things it recognizes is Eurocentrism, but the other way it recognizes it is the heritage of knowledge building, which comes from that Eurocentric perspective, is the idea of a particular model of how you understand the world. And the argument here is this, that we need to be conscious of the understanding of the world based on that model may not really help us understand something like, for example,
would you also say that they're also projected as the experts? They might no longer be wearing the white coats, but they have the title of experts and what experts they hold. Okay, let's move on because of the time, and I want to cover so much with you. Professor Salman, that's okay. No, that's great. The third aspect, the third strand of critical Muslim studies, is you talk about interrogating Muslim sphere and other marginalized people. Before, what do you mean by Muslim sphere? And why does it require a different interrogation? I mean, there's two sort of aspects.
Okay. I guess throughout my work, I'm always trying to use different kinds of ways of describing things that people may talk about. So Ummah, they may want to use the Muslim world, they kind of do that. And part of it is deliberate to be provocative and try to say not to settle on one.
Yeah.
And partly is me trying to work out how to describe this thing. Now, in terms of interrogating that or trying to interpret that, for me, the reason, and we've already alluded to this, if you tell the story of Muslimness or Muslims or Islam through the way that it has been handed to you, you will run into problems that you cannot actually solve. So we already talked about the Darwin example, but I can, there are many other examples around this. So, for example, there was a quest up to about a few years ago, even now it'll come up sometime. When will the Muslims produce their Martin Luther? And the idea is this, that the Muslims need to do what the Christians did, and they need to have some kind of reformation, right? And some people say this who are very well-meaning, and others who are incredibly hostile Islamophobics. The problem here is this, again, it's a misunderstanding of what Martin Luther was, not only because of his own kind of prejudice, but Martin Luther, even as a symbol, was rejecting the authority of the Pope.
Yes.
There is no Pope in Islam. So we have to now invent a Pope for this Martin Luther to reject.
Correct.
Now that is a nonsense of an effort to be required to do this.
Yes.
So this locks us, this may be a frivolous example, but this locks us into doing things which don't really have much value for us.
So hence it is important to understand, if you like, the cultural heritage, or if you use the word intellectual heritage of the Muslims themselves, to look at the Muslims and to see how, if you say, of course we have problems, but then to see that within that, how to come out of them.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of problems with that as well, because, so give you a lot of the ways that we understand, people would talk about Muslims would see through the prism of Islamic studies now, right? But before colonization, there wasn't really an Islamic studies as it is understood now. Muslims studied things. They didn't put the prefix Islamic on it. They just studied things. And they constructed Talal talks about a discursive tradition. They had some way of talking about things that other people have talked about, and they had debates. Sometimes one point would win, another would win. It was an ongoing conversation and discussion, etc. Right? And they had sort of rules, look, we shouldn't be doing this, we should do this, etc., etc. And you can map that out, right? And that has a tremendous resource for the community. Not because you want to go back and just retrieve that, but also to say, okay, so here's a challenge that all Muslims have faced since the demise of the Prophet, even with the Shaba and the first generation, etc. How do we act in situations which are novel, situations we don't know how to act with, right? So when the Prophet is around and you accept the authority of the Prophet, you ask the Prophet and you trust their element to work through that. Then you ask his companions and you trust that authority. And again, within different traditions, you can contest who knows more enough, something like that. But the majority of Muslim history has been lived in the absence of those authoritative figures and those authoritative traditions. So we constantly have been thrown into ways and puzzles that we have to sort out. And one of the things that I've constantly say is that if you go to anywhere among Muslim communities, there is a great investment, emotional physical, financial, in ensuring that our children learn about the basics of the faith, how it's understood.
Yeah.
There is less investment that we learn the basics of the history. So, as a consequence, most Muslims can give you quite a rich history of the beginning of Islam.
Yeah.
But if you ask them to name figures from Muslim history, which are not the latest dictator who's made his own kind of palace or whatever, what do you get? Saladin Ayyubi and
Nuruddin Zingi.
yes, basically, you know. And then you think, okay, so we can't work out, or we can't have the examples that here were these people who were struggling to try and make sense. How do we understand that? So when I say the alternative sources, as Muslims, we also have to think about how do we make those sources Muslim, etc. Because there's a constant way of writing out the Muslim. You know, the idea that people are writing books saying the end of Islam, or it's no longer relevant, or it's never been relevant, etc. So in a sense, we're involved in a disputation of trying to recover that, and in that, recover that resource for us to help to improve the diet of examples by which we can understand the Muslim condition.
Finally, the fourth aspect, you talk about critical Muslim studies being situated along post-colonial and decolonial. If it is already situated along that, why is it necessary to have critical Muslim studies?
Well, the short answer is this: because the post-colonial and the decolonial have a rather complicated history with the Islamic case, with the Muslim kind of thing. Maybe it's easier if I just give an example of that, right? So one of the things around decolonial thinking has always been that 1492 is a really good starting point, because that's
Granada.
Yeah. Well, 1492 is the year Columbus discovers I could do square quotes because we were visual. So he discovers America, and it's a year just when Granada is conquered, which is the last independent Muslim state in the Iberian Peninsula. So you would think, actually, this is great because they both tie in together. Yeah. Now, and then what happens is that you can then tell that, Islam suffers the same fate of all the other kind of decolonization. But 1492 is only around about, I've got to do the maths, 40, 50 years from 1453, when Muslims conquer Constantinople, right? The reason why after 1492, the expulsions of Muslims and Jews starts taking place is because there's a fear among the Catholic monarchies of what is Spain, that a Muslim army will come from Africa or to retake this land. There is no fear a Muslim army will come to help, for example, in Palestine or in Kashmir or there, right? So it's a very different dynamic. So to talk about the decolonial, where it reduces the Muslim to simply someone who is where history is implanted on them, and colonized history,
yes, right,
takes away from the fact that it's a much more complicated relationship. When you go to, for example, the rebellions, the first time we probably think that Allah Akbar was heard in the Western Hemisphere was probably in 1529, and I'm not sure about the date right now, but in the rebellion, the first recorded slave rebellion enslaved in Santo Domingo.
Yeah, in modern-day Brazil.
Yeah, no, in Santo Domingo in 1529.
Okay.
And basically, there was a group of Muslims who broke free, liberated other people, Muslim, non-Muslim, and tried to free themselves.
Yeah.
Now, this is almost like, 1529, it's almost 30 years of discovery. Charles V, who is the emperor at the time, introduces the first Muslim ban. He says, stop importing Muslims to America because they're a troublesome lot. Yeah. So what I'm trying to say to you,
different history.
There's slightly different histories. Now so the idea that the decolonial can simply be we can read through the decolonial everything. Often the decolonial erases these Muslim traces, for example, among the enslaved, among the kind of levels of resistance that were going on there.
Thank you for sort of helping us navigate those four strands. Very, very helpful. I want to take you further down the critical Muslim studies path and think about, you also talk about the premise of the hierarchy between the West is no longer guaranteed. Most people looking at the world around, especially now, and the power the West has got, would say, it's difficult to accept that. The West is
Do you
so.
think they would say that?
I mean, look, they can dictate from America, Washington, what is dictated happens, basically. It becomes the law.
Yeah, but I think it's a bit of a cop-out because there's two things happen.
Tell me why. Yeah.
Well, two things. Firstly, it is very easy to say that Washington controls everything because it absolves us for any responsibility for things. That's the first thing, okay? But even within the problem right now, one way I would read all of what's been going on the last 10 years or with the Trumpian presidency is actually an undermining of both American and European global hegemony. What frightens them is the fact that the Chinese economy now is probably the largest economy in the world. This has not happened for 200 years or 150 years at least. We have the idea that people think that West is best is no longer something that people just simply accept. The fact that the international human rights regime and the liberal order, which the Western powers built, they are now dismantling because it does no longer works for them.
It doesn't give them service.
Sorry?
It doesn't service them.
It doesn't service them because and that already tells you something.
Yeah.
The fact that you've had so many military interventions suggests to me that your ability to persuade has become weaker. So you have to rely more and more on coercion. Okay. And because you rely more on coercion, your persuasive power becomes weaker. So I think, there are many, many indicators that the simplest one would be in 1945, the United States GDP equal to the half of the world's GDP. It's now something like 22% or something like that. It's in that kind of ballpark figure. So, and there are many other manifestations there. From cultural effects that, up till very recently, Hollywood had to produce, when it did these blockbusters like Iron Man, they made sure for the Chinese release, they would have a Chinese character in there. Yeah. The way that the idea of ability to project themselves into the future, the more they talk about Western civilization, the more it seems to be the case that they realize that it doesn't have the same ability to authorize the rest of the world. So you have all this kind of stuff coming out about the crisis, and some of it's considered to be demographic, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think the idea that Washington controls everything is overblown. It also is a question of absolving the possibility of agency.
When you say possibility of agency, you mean are we stopping to do things about it? And
Yeah,
surrendering?
Yeah,
surrendering
I think look, it's a bit like the Wizard of Oz now, right? In the end, if you think Washington is this great wizard rather than this trickster, then you will say, what can we do against this? Washington is there. Yeah. We are so humble and things like that. And all the levels of resistance that have occurred, that have shocked that and made that difficult, we forget them, and we forget the tremendous effort in helping us forget. Okay. So for me, there are a couple of tensions in this view. And I know at some moments, of course, there's no indication that the United States doesn't have great power or such a great authority, etc. But if you look a little bit below that, the fact that it has to say it has that authority or that power suggests
and
to
use the power as well.
It has to, but it's a limited kind of thing. It doesn't mean that it can't carry out great destruction. But the problem isn't about destroying things. It's being able to actually hold things together. And that, I think, is a real question. Because in a way, the world that we live in, as I said before, was made by European colonialism, which the United States was part of and inherited. That world is no longer the same world. And this is why you have to say that we have to basically, sanction judges, even white French judges, for example, who are sitting on the International Criminal Court, so they can't use their credit cards anywhere in the world. And what do you think is going to happen? People are going to say, right, we didn't know that all these credit cards, all of these systems are controlled by Washington. Maybe we should have our own credit cards.
Okay. You touched on something quite important there. You compared.
Only one thing important?
Well, we've talked a few things, but I'll let you get away with many others. Anyway, the important point was you talked about the slippage of the West, and its hierarchy being destabilized, and you compared it with China. And that, for me, how the Muslim world or the Muslim ummah, the community, losing out in it. What position are Muslims playing, and how should we position ourselves?
The reason why I use the example of China, because I thought it would cause less confusion, because you can make a general kind of position there, right? Look, I think there is an issue right now among the among the Muslim ummah that is quite, on one hand, it's quite exciting because there's a lot of things that could happen better.
Yeah.
But for that things to happen better, we need to understand what the situation is now, right? And that I think is a challenge. So we need to see things as clearly as humanly possible without being romantic and optimistic, nor do we need to be pessimistic about it and think that it's all doomed and nothing can change. Okay. There is a moment in the I would say around about 1928, 24, when you can imagine that Islam would cease to exist in the world. And what I mean by this is that at that time, most of the Muslim countries were under European colonial rule. Indonesia was ruled by the Dutch, South Asia by the British, the French had lots of parts of Africa. There were only about 4 areas where Muslims were ruling themselves, more or less. And again, we could dispute that. The most powerful one was the Ottoman state. Then it was Iran, and then a handful of little bits and bobs here and there. Okay, we'll dismiss it on there. In 1924-25, Mustafa Kemal and his followers basically abolish the symbol of that continuity by abolishing the caliphate and introduce a lot of reforms which are basically saying we want to be modern, but what they mean by being modern is by being Western, right? Yeah. And the funny thing is this is now, we asked the earlier question, what difference does it make?
Yeah.
What Mustafa Kemal did in Turkey, this category of what I call Kemalism, didn't just apply in Turkey. You had, what was at that time, Iran, the Shah of Iran, following all his things, trying to follow the example. Afghanistan, trying to follow those kind of examples. Now, because we study and we divide what we call the Muslim lands into here's the Middle East and here's Central Asia and here's South Asia, all of that continuity gets lost. Okay. So in a sense, we already have trapped ourselves in saying, well, this only happened here. Yeah. This is completely different, even though it looks exactly the same because it happened there. Yeah. So all of these reforms and these kind of positions basically understood Westernization as the only way of modernization, right? Now, in the 1960s, you had the government in Tunisia banning fasting in Ramadan. Now, I'm not talking about the communists. I'm not talking about that, right? We're talking about a country, saying, and they said the reason they were banning it is because of economic rationality, et cetera, et cetera. It was difficult for a very long time, and I still think unless they do something else in Riyadh, they may want to do it, but anything is possible. But there are very few regimes who would be able to ban fasting in Ramadan, who would be wanting to do that. How do we explain this? If there is no sense, after basically 150 years of European colonial rule, Kemalist rule, communist rule, why is it that it has been impossible to erase this thing that we call Islam in different ways? And then we have this kind of, and the way that people are grasping at straws and new books come out and things like that, they would say things like, for example, during the Arab Spring, they would say, look, these are young people who wear jeans and are on I don't think TikTok was there, but they are wired up and this is what they're going to do and things like that, and they really are modern. And then nearly every single report would say, we don't know how big the crowd is going to be until Jummah prayers.
Yeah.
So they, one hand, they're saying these are the secular youth. Then why do you have to wait for Jummah prayers? This kind of divide, again, is a divide that comes from a particular reading of Christian history. It doesn't have particular application there. So I think right now there is a tussle going on where, for example, there are possibilities in among the Muslim communities where there's a division between those who are, let's say, for all their myriad problems,
Yeah.
accountable to somehow to their people. And then there are those who are who are accountable to nobody except themselves. And one litmus test is that wherever you can see support for Palestinians and the Palestinian cause, you will see those governments are accountable.
Yeah.
Where you see the absence of support, those governments are not accountable. Those are absolutist governments. So that's how I would say that even though you talk about this hierarchy, I'm not you, but I'm not blaming you, it seems to me that we need to see what the struggle is going on, and the possibilities are there for an attempt to recover something different than the continuation of the past, to reject Kemalism in the favor of something else, and that something else can have a name which responds to the retrieval and the projection into and going into the future. So I'm not talking about recovering of the past.
Yeah.
I'm talking about building a future with characteristics that Muslims feel that they feel at home with.
Sticking with Kemalism, you talk about Kemalism breaking or displacing Islam from public sphere. Right. Expand on that, because that's almost continuation of a discussion here. And how do the modern 21st century, particularly young British Muslims, relate to that?
Well, I think what I was trying to say is this, is that, I mean, this goes back to the history of the symbolic effect of the caliphate in a way, right? It's just a way of illustrating this. I think it's more complex than that. Among Muslims, whichever mother they came from, there was a recognition that there should be the caliphate exist, right? They may have disputed who should be Khalifa.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
That is another matter.
Yeah.
They may have disputed how they should become Khalifa, but no one disputed the idea that they should be a Khalifa, right? And again, it's interesting that there were lots of attempts by colonialists to try and discredit and argue for other kinds of caliphates and things like that, right? So when you had that position, it was the problem for Muslims faced was a straightforward one. We need to get the right caliph because we got the right system. We just need to have the right executive and everything will be fine. With the abolition, the risk is that, well, we don't even have a system anymore.
Yeah.
We don't have the institution. So in the absence of that institution, you then have to start thinking about how should Muslims live and how should they govern. And there are different Muslim scholars give different answers to this. I think what has happened with Kemalism in a way is that it has become zombified. It's discredited. Nobody believes in it, but they carry on because they've got nothing else to offer. A bit like, many of the social democratic parties. Everyone carries on with them because that's all they can do, but they don't have any answers anymore. Yeah. So I think in terms of Muslims in Britain or in France or anywhere else, they are responding to the possibility of saying, okay, what is it that we need to build for the future? When we don't have this authoritative answer already, so we need to start thinking about how we can be active in building a better future for us. And that is what I think is already in there. And it marks itself out in different ways. And you can see that around you.
That's very helpful. This is a final question. We live in a Western cultural heritage, or even hegemony, some might argue. How does critical Muslim studies propose a transformation or to interject within that system that we are living in? Because I think that is very significant for a lot of people. One is obviously being academic and the other is being practical. How if you can touch on those 2 points?
I think there are two aspects to this.
Yes.
You know me saying this. It's very easy to say that we live in a Western cultural heritage or Germany, and there's an element of truth in that as well. What's not clear is what actually is meant by this. So to give you just another example, in a way, right? You would think, or most people would think, that AI, all the kind of computer technology, is Western.
Sure.
Okay, because it's
Yeah.
computers, whatever, right? We know that this is based on binary
Yeah.
code, right? Which is basically zeros and ones, zeros and ones. Romans didn't have zeros properly. The zeros came from India via Muslims working on the Muslim mathematicians. This is about algebra and all of these things there. So you could imagine a huge future history written that you could not have had AI without mathematics coming from these places. Now, what that does is completely change our understanding of what it is. So that's one element on this, and I want to mention that. In terms of practical terms, I think it's very, very straightforward. I think what we need to be doing, and like any community needs to be doing, is simply enlarging the way in which we create a new common sense, a new way of understanding the world. And in some ways, that means building upon with allies and others on things that have already been achieved. And the example that I always come to is the one, and many of our listeners probably will only know this sort of third hand, if at all. If you speak to, in this country, just to make it very, very limited example, black footballers in the Premiership who played in the 1980s and the 1990s. And sometimes you listen to them and they talk about how they suffered racial abuse. Sometimes even now these grown men have tears in their eyes. And what was interesting is that when they were playing at that time, it was almost impossible to name it, to describe it. And when they tried, because there was no, they were dismissed as, oh, this is just a bit of banter, football's always been like this, whatever, it has no meaning to it. Throwing banana skins is not that particularly different, et cetera, et cetera.
Be a man, take it.
Yeah, all that kind of thing, and it was a constant. Now, 30, 40 years later, you have two things which are quite extraordinary, at least among the elite clubs. If someone is being abusive towards a footballer from Algeria or Senegal or whatever, it is quite likely that somebody from the crowd will point it out. It is quite likely the stewards will pick that person out and escort them out. We had the spectacle of an English team walking out of a match because the abuse its black players were suffering. They didn't walk out when John Barnes was playing or other players playing,
in the 80s
right?
and 90s,
So what happened? Somehow we've moved to a position where racism was identified culturally. So most people who know this don't know, they're not lawyers. They don't know what the legal position is. But even 10-year-old or even 5-year-old children can say this is racism and it's wrong. Now, we need to make the similar kind of efforts around Islamophobia. We need to remember how we got to those positions. And we do this by helping change our understanding of those things and building on what we've already achieved. So now we're involved in a struggle where there's an attempt to almost go back to the 1970s, not in a good way, in terms of saying, well, I don't care if I'm a racist. Even though, even at this moment in time, the most racist people will deny that they're racist, even when they're committing their acts of racism. Now that shows to me there's a change in the culture. And it's not just about racism. You could say the same thing around sexism, for example, right? The misogyny that was considered to be, normalized in workplaces and things like that is no longer simply unremarked. So that for me is to think about changing practically the common sense in these areas. And for my Muslims, Islamophobia then becomes a vanguard or a wedge issue to help change the common sense around other issues.
I'm going to retract when I said that was going to be my last question because you touched on something else. We're going to have to carry on a little bit longer. Sorry about this.
It's your audience I'm worried about. I could go on.
No, because I think it's a very sensitive issue. And this is the idea of Islamophobia, of course. In a way, Islamophobia has replaced racism against the African Caribbeans. It's the worst form of racism at the moment that is around, most pervasive. How do Muslims try and address that? And we've also got the government trying to redefine it or bring about, washing out of the word Islamophobia completely and replacing by other terminologies. Are those things important? First, if we talk about the government's approach, is the word Islamophobia important for us to maintain? And the second aspect is how then do we as a community try and rise up like the Afro-Caribbean community did to tackle the examples you gave about football? How do we do that?
I think it's really important because part of anyone who's read 1984 or knows, it's one of those books people don't read it, but they know about it.
Yeah.
And part of it is Newspeak. So the idea is that you change the language to stop things being said.
Yeah.
And the example that I gave about the footballers in the 1980s is that until the word racism began to circulate in the culture, there was a whole set of experiences that could not really be spoken. They couldn't really express them in a way that was meaningful.
Yeah.
So Islamophobia is critically important. It's also important because it circulates internationally.
Yeah.
When we have Zohran Mamdani in his victory stage
in New
York, in his speech after he becomes mayor, in a campaign which often involved a lot of Islamophobic tropes, he is willing to say that in New York it shows that you can't win an electoral campaign by trafficking Islamophobia. He is willing to use that word. The UN is willing to use that word. Then do you think that this government, which says this word is banned, is going to have much significance? The problem is this, that if the Muslim community buys into that, then they will not be able to speak. This game of definitions is really almost like a trap, because the problem here is this, that there is a term, this has been defined, that Islamophobia is a type of racism that works within the kind of community, it works everywhere else, and that's it. There is nothing else to be said about this. It's not up to the government to come up with this new whatever. And what will they do with this?
Sure.
So if the government is serious about taking action against Islamophobia, then they need to demonstrate why they're understanding. And I don't think they do, because for them, the definition is everything. When for us, the definition is basically a condensation of an understanding.
Yeah.
If you understand Islamophobia is a type of racism, then you have 50 years of history to draw upon on how to combat it in big ways and small ways.
Yeah.
The other point I would make is that I think it's not just the racism wasn't just the question of the Afro-Caribbean community. It was about building an alliance across forces. And again, the first piece of anti-racist legislation in this country is not by accident, occurs in 1965, at the height of the civil rights in the US, at the heights of anti-colonial struggles. Malcolm X is coming down there. These things are connected. And if we try and disconnect them, and we don't see the problem and the challenge as a global challenge, we are basically cutting off our own arms ability to do that. If you are really concerned about what is happening to the Muslim community, you don't have to worry just about what's happening in Palestine. You can say this is special. You don't have to worry about what's happening in Kashmir, because that's another complicated, or let alone in East Turkestan, because that's another issue, or among the Rohingya. Look across the channel. What is happening in Austria? What is happening in France? That where the governments are introducing policies which are making it more and more difficult for Muslimness to thrive in any way with any sense of belonging. And that is the challenge we have to face. And by the way, France doesn't talk about racism still, and certainly doesn't talk about Islamophobia. So maybe if they started using the word Islamophobia more properly, that might help change the conversation.
Okay. Just
another final question.
Not just a quote, not necessarily a question, just a passing message, shall we say, put it more humbly. What kind of advice or conversation you'd like the community to be having around the conversation we've had about critical Muslim studies, how to look at knowledge formation and understand history more holistic, right across the globe and connecting? How would you ask them which way to look and how to expand on that?
Look, I think there are so many people in the community who care so much, work so hard against really, really difficult challenges. My kind of encouragement, more than anything else, is that we should learn about the history as much as we learn about Deen.
Yeah.
We should be as confident as we are in our expressing our religiosity,
Yeah.
and we should be in terms of expressing our Muslimness. I think our sense of Muslimness should be embracive and extensive. So, for example, there are people who are Palestinian who are not Muslim,
Yeah.
but they are tarred with the same Islamophobic tropes. There are people who are supporting the Palestinian cause who are neither Palestinian or Muslim or Christian. They may be atheists, but they will get Muslimized
Yeah.
in that kind of discourse. And we need to recognize that. So I think for me, the only thing is that we should think that we contain multitudes, we are large, and we should really try and be aware of the responsibility that gives us to underwrite the needs. This planet has to be plural. And in a sense, the struggle against Islamophobia is not just a struggle for Muslim rights, but it is a struggle to have a world which is full of pluralisms.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Professor Salman, for your time and joining us. And hopefully we should see you soon again.
Inshallah. Well, thank you so much for having me.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Dr. Ismail, I'm going to dive right into it and ask you quite a big question off the bat, actually. Fact-finding, knowledge, information in the construct of language. Deeply complex, some people might say. Where do you begin?
In a way, if you put it in that context, it sounds difficult. But if you think about the reason it's become difficult is because we've been enveloped and surrounded by a way of knowledge formation that has taken us away from the traditional way of thinking. And it has fragmented society according to the Western way of thinking, the Eurocentric way of thinking.
Yeah.
And I think one thing that Professor Salman is trying to tell us is there is an alternative way of thinking. And that alternative way is not alien to us. It has been part of our way of life. Past predecessors have used it, and we need to excavate that and use the present challenges and use it in that context. So it's difficult in a way. It sounds theoretical, but it is, once we understand and grasp the importance of it, I think it will bear phenomenal fruit. And I think this is a challenge that a lot of people are not thinking about, but I think this is the first step towards that liberating of your mind.
Absolutely. And Professor Salman touched on this, and you had quite interesting discussions with him. Often the West, and has throughout history, been used as a goal-point standard for societies and civilizations for throughout history. But as Muslims living in the West, some may say we've become comatose to everything. So we're living in that system, and the system that how do we begin? Yes, knowledge, of course, attaining that knowledge and understanding the language and all of those things that you discussed. But as practical steps, how do we begin, and where do we begin understanding that?
I think maybe you should have asked him directly, but I think knowing him quite well and reading some of his works, I think the two things we have to be very take into account. First is to make sure the people we read are the people who have the plurality of the world at their heart. They're looking at the world and the society and trying to respect each other's cultures. Once you look at a unipolar author, either it be Eurocentric or any other society for that matter, then I think you'll be taken on a path that will be difficult for you to liberate. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I think, to be able to teach this to our children from a very young age. Our children should understand that there is an alternative way to see the world. And we should bring that into the curriculum of our society and community. And Muslims are very well placed for that, because not only do our children go to schools, but they also go to madrasas.
Of course, yeah.
And there is a platform there. And that's a great resource we have. And Muslims should be able to understand and nurture that, and nurture our children through that institutes towards that mind, as we said, become the lantern of liberation. We might use that term.
Brilliant plug there. Brilliant plug there.
Okay.
I think a point that you just mentioned there actually leads on to my final question for you there, is we can see the challenges, we understand the challenges, and you touched on with Professor Salman also the tangible steps briefly. But what seems as a massively momentous task, you touched on the madrasa system, but as people who aren't, maybe let's say we've not aren't in madrasa or past or at later stages of their lives, we all have to begin somewhere. But where do you believe that those steps, as Muslims living in the West, where do those steps start to begin?
I think most of the Muslims are already taking that step. I mean, if you look at their concern, their worry not finding themselves in the position that we do find ourselves in the West, particularly in Britain at the moment, but also thinking about other people. I mean, look at the demonstrations on Palestine.
Absolutely.
Look at about, even talking about the refugees and the homelessness. The Muslims' philanthropy in this country is phenomenal.
Absolutely.
Because we're concerned about that. We are the most generous community. And so the Muslim community and society is already there. It just needs that a little bit of more nurturing them and making them understand and shifting them towards more cohesive, coordinated efforts from different communities and building on that. But I have great hopes.
Absolutely.
I have great hopes.
I did say that was my final question,
Yeah.
but this is actually my final question now. When we've seen in the country that we're living in, of course, in Britain, that there's been a stark rise of Islamophobia.
Sure.
And it seems to be continually getting worse. And people say, well, it's all doom and gloom.
Yeah.
We may as well just stay at home or, almost go to a cave and never come out again and see what comes of it. But when the problems we face are deeply rooted on a governmental level as well, where do you believe that middle ground is? Where is that middle ground in combating that?
I think middle ground may be not the right word to
Yeah.
use, but I think what I would say, this is the opportunity for Muslims to rise up and to be recognized as who they are. Remember, it is only through challenges that opportunities arises.
Absolutely.
And yes, Islamophobia is a huge challenge for Muslims, and there's going to be many victims. But this challenge is an opportunity for us to rise up and to be counted and gain that agency and be respected. And for that, we'll have to struggle.
Absolutely.
And we'll have to, as long as we struggle and we have people like Professor Salman, helping us guide and navigate this, I think hopefully we'll come out better and stronger.
Brilliant. Dr. Ismail, thank you very much. Thank you for watching. If this conversation sparks something in you, share it, talk about it, and keep asking the difficult questions.